Well, um, one of the beliefs that we saw was very prominent in Descartes and the other rationalists, even though we didn't look at them, people like Spinoza and Leibniz, was a view that goes all the way back to Plato, and that's the view that we have some knowledge at birth, call it having innate ideas or innate knowledge. And we saw this was very important for Descartes because that was the way he tried to get us out of skepticism by using his innate knowledge of something like God to try to prove God's existence from what he thought was his innate idea of God, and then that God is no deceiver, and that we can trust that he won't allow us to be deceived in our views about other things like the material world around us. However, for the empiricists, the mind does not come into this world with a lot of knowledge already in it. And by the way, it was not particular facts that was thought to be innate knowledge, but knowledge of general truths like moral truths, like the truths of mathematics, things like that were claimed to be innate. Along with religious truth, like our idea of God. But Locke spends quite a bit of time in his essay concerning human understanding, the book where he gets out his views on the theory of knowledge. In the first two books there, he actually spends quite a bit of time arguing against the view that we have any innate ideas. Now, we didn't go into his arguments, but Locke not only thought we don't have any innate ideas, but he went through considerable trouble to try to refute the view that we did. So for Locke, the mind at birth, and here we come to the first bullet point, is the tabula rasa, a blank tablet or a blank slate. It's like these blackboards here. So there's no knowledge in us when we come into this world. And all of our knowledge then, and this is the view of empiricism. Empiricism is the view that all knowledge has to be based on experience after we're born, that we don't have any knowledge unrelated to experience like innate ideas. And so the mind is like a blank tablet at birth, and what writes on this tablet is our experiences after birth, both our inner mental experiences, but most importantly, our observational experiences about the world. So empiricism basically says that if we have any claims to knowledge, that they need to be based on what our senses tell us. And of course, the point is, if a view like Descartes seems a little unusual, it's that we grew up as empiricists. You know, when every science class we had, and other classes, I mean, we pretty much assumed that something like empiricism is true, that knowledge comes by observations about the world. And so now there is a view, though, that the empiricists inherited from Descartes, and it's the view that the mind is not directly acquainted with anything other than its own inner mental life. That we are in what has come to be called the egocentric predicament. That our mind experiences only its own inner life. And for Locke, that's what ideas are. Idea is a technical term, and he defines it as whatever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. whatever the mind can be employed about in thinking. In other words, whatever we experience for Locke is an idea, either within us, like an experience of a pain in my shoulder, or anything observationally outside of us, like my experience of the black color of the blackboard, or that it's a little cool in this room. And so, idea is a technical term, and it refers to all of the experiences we have that are part of our inner mental life. Excuse me. But another way that ideas are looked upon as the immediate objects of perception. In other words, if I have any knowledge of something outside of myself, like that there's a suitcase, a wheelie type suitcase on the floor, or there's a blackboard over there, that knowledge comes from experience, but I don't experience the external world directly for Locke. There is a real external world. For Locke, that blackboard was here when you and I weren't here, existing separately as a material object. When my suitcase is existing in the corner, it doesn't need me to be perceiving it to exist. It's there. But we do not experience the world directly. We experience it through our ideas. And for Locke, our ideas have two sources. What goes on in our own thinking and our own minds, like a memory idea, or a feeling of warmth, or a feeling of pain. Those are ideas we get from what Locke calls sensation. I'm sorry, from what he calls reflection. Reflection on what goes on in our own minds. It's like, and they call that introspection, looking into our own minds, finding that I have a pain in my shoulder. The other ideas we get are what we get from what we experience that's going on outside of ourselves, from sensation. But here's the key thing. On a view like Locke's, the mind is never directly acquainted with things in the external world. It experiences only its own ideas directly. Another way that this is put is that there's a veil of ideas between us and the world. And the problem is, even though Locke himself was not a skeptic, this led down the garden path to skepticism. Because once you put an intermediate something between you and your experiences of the world, the question arises, well, how do I know that knowledge that I seem to have that is knowledge of things in an external world is knowledge at all? Well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But so there are two types of ideas, but ideas are ideas of the properties of things. And a single idea of a single property is what Locke calls a simple idea. In other words, my single idea of the black color of that blackboard, or my single idea of the coolness of this blackboard when I touch it, especially the metal part. My single idea of the silverish color of the aluminum. So simple ideas usually relate to one sense, and they relate to one property. My idea of the sound the blackboard makes when I hit it like I'm not supposed to do. But you say, but an object like the blackboard, or like in my slides, the telephone, has lots of different properties. And so our experience of something like a telephone or like the blackboard over there is that experience is a complex idea that's made up of ideas of many single properties, like the color of the blackboard, its shape, its size, its weight if we'd ever pick it up and had to move it somewhere, its coolness to the touch, it's the feeling of hardness we'd get if we touched it. All of these are ideas we have of the properties of that blackboard. So my experience of the blackboard is a complex idea. It is an idea of a thing that has many properties, but we can divide it up. It's composed of simple ideas that are of the single properties of a thing, like its size, shape, texture, color, etc. So now the point is, for Locke, not every idea I have of the properties of something like the blackboard is an idea that actually represents a property that the blackboard has in the real world. There's a difference between the world as I perceive it and the world as it is. The world as it appears to me and the world as it is. We talk about this as the difference between appearance and reality. And the blackboard appears to me to have a color. It appears to me to have coolness to the touch. But for Locke, these are secondary properties, and they're subjective and in us. On a view like Locke's, colors aren't really properties in things. They're caused by objects and their primary properties. Remember, Locke is a friend with Newton. Locke knows about molecules and atoms. He knows about light and that molecules and atoms, their motion, can cause feelings in us. They knew that the motions of molecules could cause feelings of heat and cold, that they could produce in us sensations like the sensation of black when I look at the blackboard. But for Locke, it's only what he calls primary properties that are really in something as it exists in the world, and primary properties exist whether they're perceived or not. In other words, when you and I are not here, the blackboard still has the size it has. It still has the shape it has. It still fills up the space. It's still extended in space. It still has a certain weight. It still has a feeling of hardness. These, it still is something that could be moved in space. If it fell down for some reason and moved when we weren't here, it doesn't need us to move. These are primary properties of a thing, and they are in things independent of our perceiving them. But colors aren't. Now, again, this can be believable if you think about somebody like my dad who is colorblind. And you could say, well, it's the motion of the molecules and things that causes in somebody like me or you who's not colorblind color sensations like red, green, and amber when we come up to a traffic light. But to somebody who's colorblind like my dad would have been, those colors aren't there. Shades of gray. So we can say, well, the colors are something subjective and in us. They're not really in the traffic light. Yeah, you had your hand up? Okay, so primary qualities, and again, there's no shortcut. Sometimes you have to just memorize them, but primary qualities usually are the kinds of things we can experience with more than one sense. But they're things like the size, the shape, the number of something, its extension in space, hardness, motion. These, for Locke, are primary properties. Secondary properties usually relate to only one sense. They're things like smells, sounds, tastes, you know, and those are subjective and in us, for Locke. Now, the point is, Locke believes that when we look at something like the blackboard, the mind is not directly acquainted with the blackboard as it is in the world, but there are certain factors about the blackboard, namely its primary properties, which my inner image of the blackboard represents to me. It represents, for instance, that the blackboard really does have the rectangular shape. In other words, the blackboard in the real world really is rectangular. It represents the blackboard as one blackboard. Number is a primary property of something. My inner image of the blackboard represents roughly its size and well, we said its shape, its weight, or the feeling of hardness. And these, for Locke, really resemble properties that the blackboard actually has in the world. But the problem is, this is what's called a representative theory of perception, that we never perceive things in the world directly. The mind is never directly acquainted with things in the external world, but they are represented to us by our ideas, by our inner experiences of something. Just in the way that a picture on a television or in a newspaper of Barack Obama represents the president, right? And we can say, well, we know what the president looks like even if we've never seen him in person, because we've seen pictures of him that represent what he looks like. And this is Locke's view, that our inner ideas really do represent the world to us, at least as far as the primary properties go, but that some of these properties are subjective and in us. And we saw his argument that feelings of warmth and cold are subjective and in us. You know, that if we had a warm and cold water, warm and cold, hot and cold water, and we conditioned our hands and then we put them into lukewarm water, one hand would feel cold, the other would feel warm. And you can say, well, the same water can't have two opposite properties. How do we get around the contradiction? Well, we conclude that warmth and cold aren't really properties of the water, but they're subjective and in us. Smells. You know, one of the things that Berkeley, when he was trying to agree with Locke, said, look, the smell of a dead body must be a lot more appetizing to a buzzard than it is to us. But smells are subjective that aren't of something as repulsive as that, right? I mean, I told you that I couldn't even stand the smell of green peppers. I couldn't go in the house when my mother was fixing stuffed peppers. And yet other people, you know, I had a roommate in grad school, not a roommate, but a housemate who loved green peppers. One of his favorite snacks. And you have to say, somehow the smell must strike him different than it does me. So, and Berkeley agreed with Locke about these secondary properties. Berkeley, for instance, when he's discussing heat and cold, I love his argument here. As on a cold day like today, or a snowy day like we had Monday, don't you like to come in the house if you had a nice stove or nice fireplace and you can get warm by the fireplace, right? And it's very pleasant, right, to come in out of the cold and you're wet and you stand by the fireplace and you get warm. Well, Berkeley knew this, and he says, well, wait a second, isn't a lesser degree of heat, like from the fireplace, you're feeling the heat, and it's pleasant. Isn't that a pleasurable sensation? It feels pleasant to you. So a lesser degree of heat is gives you sensations of pleasure. But now suppose you wanted to warm yourself up a little too quickly and you got too close to the fire and you slightly burned yourself. Well, that would be from a more intense degree of heat, and so that would cause you pain. But Berkeley says, well, so an intense degree of heat would be a feeling of pain or a painful sensation. Yeah, you have your...
Which qualities are represented to us by resemblance on last week's
I'm getting to that, but I do. Basically, it's I've already said it. The primary qualities are represented to us by resemblance. In other words, my subjective image of that rectangular blackboard really resembles and represents the rectangular shape of the blackboard. My image really resembles and represents its size and its shape to me. Whereas the secondary properties, there's nothing in the blackboard like the color black. And so my sensations do not represent or resemble anything like the secondary qualities. And so heat and cold are secondary properties. And let me finish what I was talking about. So Berkeley says, wait a second. A lesser degree of heat is a feeling of pleasure. And a more intense degree of heat is painful or feeling of pain. Well, wait a second. You wouldn't want to say that pleasure and pain are in the fireplace or in the fire as properties of the fire. Then what would make you want to say that warmth and cold are in the fire as properties of the fire instead of being subjective and in us? Now, I try to say these people are slick. They'll talk you out of your wallet. But this was an argument that Berkeley used in his little book, Three Dialogues, to try to reinforce Locke's claim that the secondary properties are simply subjective and in us. The fire is not really in the fireplace. It's only ignorant non-philosophers who go around saying things like the blackboard really is black and the fire really has heat in it. But educated people, philosophers, really know that these properties are only subjective and in us. That was the attitude of the empiricists. Now, of course, I mean, the empiricists were wrong about this, and the Scottish philosophers and contemporary philosophers, like you saw in the video, like Hilary Putnam, have gone back to the view of the ordinary man on the street, that we really directly perceive books, not an internal image of books. We really perceive the blackboard, not an internal image of the blackboard, and the blackboard really is black. and the fire really has heat in it as a property. But the point is, these were considered to be only sensations. Now, here's the problem with a view like Locke's. If our knowledge comes from our ideas by sensation and reflection, and our ideas are supposed to represent. This is called indirect realism. We never experience the external world directly, but only through internal representations. Well, as I said when I was illustrating this before, the real problem that arises is, how do we know that our inner representation of something really represents things as they are in the external world? And I gave the example of the stereo store that had a camera on a doll and projected the picture on various large screen TVs. And you could tell if the picture accurately represented the qualities of the doll by looking at the picture and looking at the doll and comparing them. But on the view like Locke's, and Hume points this out, the only thing we're ever acquainted with are our ideas, our own inner mental life. So we can never get beyond our ideas, behind our ideas, to compare them with the real world, to confirm a view like Locke's that they sometimes accurately represent the world. We can't tell if they accurately represent the world. And of course, for somebody like Berkeley, for whom everything is mental, they don't represent anything. Everything is just sensations and ideas. They don't represent something beyond them. So a view like Locke's can lead to skepticism about even the existence of an external world, because not only do you not know whether your ideas accurately represent the world to you, you don't know whether they represent anything at all. There may just be your ideas and nothing behind them. And that's where Descartes' view gets us, that we're in the egocentric predicament. If the mind is first acquainted only with its own mental life, you have the problem of justifying how it is that we know anything beyond our own inner experiences. And Hume basically says, look, in the average everyday affairs of life, I have to behave like anyone else. When I leave my study and I go down and I eat with my friends and I play some backgammon, Hume says I've got to behave like everybody else, that they're real people, that the backgammon set's real, that the food I'm eating is real. But he says when I go up into my study, I can't justify any of this philosophically from the assumption that I know only my own inner mental life, my own perceptions. And this is where a view like Locke's leads us. So, so the qualities represented to us by resemblance are the primary qualities, and the secondary properties are subjective. So Locke has gone half the way to Berkeley, and Berkeley agrees about the secondary properties. The way Berkeley tries to show everything is mental is by providing arguments meant to show that the primary properties also are mental. Now, see, Berkeley is very religious, a very devout Christian, and he knows that a view like Locke's that puts a veil of ideas, this is sometimes called veil of ideas skepticism, that the mind is first acquainted only with its own ideas and they have to represent the world to us. If you put a veil of ideas between us and the world, pretty soon, as Thomas Reid pointed out, it's hard to keep the ideas from taking over everything and from saying that's all that exists. Well, Berkeley is more than happy to say that. Berkeley tries to defend Christianity by undermining the existence of material substance as something that exists independent in the world apart from its being perceived. Yeah. Okay. These things down at the bottom, I sometimes cover them. They happen to be there. I should have taken them out. We didn't cover Locke's political views, so just scratch them out. You know, on what did Locke base our right to property? Scratch that out. What is his citation of property rights? We didn't cover any of that. So good question. That you know, there won't be any questions on the test having to do with that. So Berkeley thinks that he's worried as a devout Christian that, you know, my mother liked the old expression, if you give them an inch, they'll take a foot. And he thought this is what would happen with a lot of people who believe that there's an external material world that exists independent of you or I, independent of perceivers. If you give them an inch, they'll take a foot. If you allow some people to claim that an external material world exists, then they're going to go all the way to claiming that that's all that exists. And this is where Thomas Hobbes was, that everything is mental, that only the material world exists. Well, if only a material world exists and God is a spirit, those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth, what happens to God? What happens to our soul or spirit? Well, they're kaput, and Berkeley knows this. So he wants to cut the legs out from under the stool of the philosophical materialist, the person who thinks that only matter exists, by showing you that matter doesn't exist at all. That the only things that exist are mental, minds and experiences or sensations in minds. Now, Berkeley does not think he's a skeptic. He argues in Three Dialogues, well, what is a skeptic anyway but somebody who doubts of something? And Berkeley says, I'm not asking you to doubt whether or not the material world exists. I'm telling you straight up that there is no material world. There's no doubt about it for me, says Berkeley. Now, David Hume, on the other hand, said that Berkeley's arguments are merely skeptical, can be seen from this, that they admit of no refutation and they produce no conviction. In other words, go back to Berkeley's argument about the heat and the fire. We can listen to an argument like that, where Berkeley says a low degree of heat is a pleasant sensation, a high degree of heat is a painful sensation. So if we don't think pleasure and pain are in the fire, why should we think heat is a property of the fire? We can look at an argument like that and not know how to refute it. They admit of no refutation. But that doesn't mean that we buy it. That we say, okay, Berkeley, yeah, right, there's no heat in a fire. I was only stupid to think so. You know, and Hume says this is a characteristic of skeptical arguments, that we can have arguments to say we can't prove our existence as the same person. We can't prove the existence of the material world. We can't prove the efficacy of cause and effect. We can't prove that the future will be like the past. But we can't act that way in our daily lives. I have to tell you people, go out and buy a stupid Scantron form for Friday, because you are going to exist as the same person Friday, and you're gonna be in here taking an exam. you know, and I'm going to say if you got good grades on your first two tests, you're going to be the same person at the end of the semester who got those good grades and who I'm giving the grade to, you know. Now, Hume tries to argue that we cannot prove that philosophically, and that's the point of the PowerPoint on the self. Now, we went over that, but most of the questions are going to be on Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley, okay? So, okay, a hand. Okay, idealism, it would be better called ideaism, but idealism is the philosophical view that matter does not exist, that everything that exists is mental. For Berkeley, the only two types of existing things, and they're really the same type, are minds, which are mental substance, and the ideas or experiences of minds, the sensations minds have. There is no independently existing material world for Berkeley. So immaterialism or idealism is the view that everything is mental. There is no material. There is no matter. Now, esse percipi is the phrase that sums up his whole philosophy. To be is to be perceived. And you can understand how he gets to that if you understand what a material object is to us as we experience it on a view like Locke's. What is it? What is the telephone but a complex idea that's composed of many simple ideas? What is a telephone but a conglomeration of various properties? The telephone's color, its size, its shape, its feeling of weight, its extension in space, its ability to move in space. All of these are properties of the telephone. But Locke has gone halfway to where Berkeley is by arguing that secondary qualities are subjective and in us. They're not even in the telephone. The color is not in the telephone. It doesn't feel, a feeling of coolness is not in the telephone if you touch it. Only the primary properties. What Berkeley tries to show is that you can provide similar arguments to show that even the primary properties are subjective and mind-dependent. And he does that by taking a property like size and saying, well, the size of a mite's foot is different to different perceivers. Hence, there's no such thing as the size of the mite's foot. You say, but isn't there such a thing as the size of the table? Well, in high school, I used to get tickets to the old Bullets games on my high school ID and $1, but they were way up in the nosebleed section. Well, a table like that looks very small from the nosebleed section. And so Hume and Berkeley say, wait, even primary properties are not really in things. So if primary properties and secondary properties are all sensations in us, sensations don't exist by themselves independently of a perceiver, independently of a mind capable of experiencing a sensation. It makes no sense to say there's a sensation of pain in this room, but nobody's feeling it, and that sensation of pain is going to be around when you and I leave the room. If I claim that, you think I'm ready for the funny farm, right? But Berkeley says, wait a second. If things like color, size, taste, feelings of hardness, shape are nothing but sensations, and sensations need a perceiver to exist, then what we experience as a material object is just a bunch of sensations, and all those sensations need a mind to exist. So, S percipi. To be is to be perceived. For the telephone to exist, it has to be perceived by some mind or other, ours or God's. Yeah.
Argument for mental dependency.
Yeah. So, in other words, all sensations are dependent on a mind for their existence. Well, they're mind dependent. But if a telephone, what we call a material object, is nothing but a collection of sensations, and they all have to depend on a mind for their existence, then the whole object is mind dependent, or dependent on a mind for its existence. Hence, there is no world of material objects that exist independently of minds for Berkeley. There are only sensations that depend on a mind, either ours or God's or both. The sensations that are independent of our will, Berkeley says, are sensations or ideas produced in us directly by God. God produces sensations about the blackboard and about the table in me. So I'm sort of perceiving God's idea along with God. So that's how you get S percipi. To be is to be perceived by some mind or other. So the mental dependency of ideas have to depend on a mind for their existence. But if a material object to us is only a conglomeration of ideas, then the whole object is dependent on a mind for its existence. And there is no matter for Berkeley. Now, Hume's view on this is that we don't know. We immediately experience only perceptions, and he says, I don't know if everything's mental. I don't know if there's a material world behind our perceptions. He says we can't know for sure one way or another, so Hume is going to be skeptical. He's going to say, well, all we experience are our perceptions, our ideas and impressions, and we don't know. We can't defend the claim that they relate to a world that exists beyond those perceptions. So Hume says, I'm going to be skeptical about the existence of a material world, of myself as a continuing substance. So
you said
yeah.
Hume is going to be on the panel or not?
There will be a little bit on Hume, but most of it, spend most of your study time on Descartes and Locke and Berkeley. Most of the questions are going to relate to that, because we just didn't have as much time for Hume. Okay, and again, you've got integrity files of all this, and the PowerPoints are there as well. Take care. See you all Friday. Sorry it's Friday the 13th, but, what can I say? Okay, if anyone has any work to turn in, you can just bring it up, lay it on the desk, and let me